Hello, I'm going to be talking today about Uber and the problems that it has been encountering in Europe. So I'm going to start my speech now. The taxi drivers in Brussels were on strike recently. This did not affect me directly, I have to say. I don't often take taxis in Brussels. I find them quite expensive and sometimes not that reliable. I've been in a taxi that's gotten lost in Brussels before. The main effect of the taxi drivers' strike was that it meant that it was very hard to get to work on my bicycle because the taxi drivers were blocking roads with their cars in the EU quarter. And so I ended up getting into work actually about 15 minutes late. Why were the taxi drivers on strike, though? The answer can be summed up in one word: Uber. The taxi drivers argue, and taxi drivers say this not just in Belgium, but in many other European countries too. They argue that the rise of the online ride-sharing service that Uber offers amounts to unfair competition, which will put them eventually out of business. Uber launched its ride-sharing service in Europe in April 2014. That was after having originally started up in the United States in 2009. Uber, as we know, basically allows ordinary car owners without any special license or training to offer rides to the public at prices lower than those charged by licensed taxi cabs. The service, as I say, was introduced in the spring of 2014 in Europe, in Paris, in Brussels, and in Barcelona first, with a view to rapidly expanding the service and rolling it out in other European countries. Now, crucially, when it introduced its service into Europe, Uber did not ask for permission. This is very much in line with the Uber philosophy. They have a rather bullish CEO who operates according to the motto, it's easier to ask for forgiveness than for permission. So they didn't ask for any authorization to launch. In fact, this is a key issue in the whole debate that has arisen around Uber, whether or not authorization should be required before a company like Uber can start operations. But when they started in Europe, they didn't ask for any authorization. They just started. And the idea was, the thinking in Uber was that if there were any objections by European regulators or indeed by existing taxi companies, well, then these objections could be countered by mobilizing the users of the service. This is what Uber had done in the United States, where it succeeded in rallying lots of its customers to lobby politicians and watchdogs on its behalf. So Uber thought it could do the same thing in Europe. But that aggressive approach hasn't worked in Europe as it has worked in the United States, and it certainly probably says something about the difference between the two continents. Indeed, Uber faced very stiff resistance from the word go in Europe. There were angry protests. There were even attacks on Uber drivers in France, leading to the company having to suspend operations in France. And it has since been ruled against by the French courts. Uber is also facing bans, court-ordered bans in Germany, Italy, and Spain. 75 Uber cars have been impounded in Belgium. Drivers have been arrested in Brussels and Amsterdam and elsewhere. And last year in June, France's chief Uber executive was arrested along with the company's general manager for Western Europe. They were charged with misleading commercial practices. Within the Uber group, not everybody was surprised at the resistance that Uber met with in Europe. When they launched their operations in the spring of 2014, the company's European business and legal team repeatedly warned their US bosses that the move would likely be met with resistance, both from the regulators and from the taxi drivers. But when this was pointed out by the European policy chief, when he expressed this concern directly to the Uber CEO, he was promptly fired. Now, as I say, there's been a lot of resistance to Uber in France. Resistance has been particularly fierce in France. Taxi drivers in France, of course, sometimes have to pay as much as €250,000 in order to get a traditional taxi license. There's been a lot of resistance, as I've said, in other European countries too. For example, in Germany, where taxi companies are required to obtain commercial driving licenses and insurance policies before they can operate a for-hire service. Now, Uber's argument in all of this, of course, is that it is not running a taxi operation. It is offering a technology platform, a digital service, an information society service, in fact. And so many of the regulations that rightly apply to taxi companies should not apply, they say, to Uber. The company does not consider the drivers that use its system as their employees. They refer to them as partners who contract to use the Uber technology. But the critics argue that that position allows Uber to avoid significant costs attached to running a traditional taxi service, paying employment benefits like sick pay or holidays, for example. In Germany, Uber has been taken to the courts to challenge the company under the city passenger transport laws. These laws require drivers to be licensed if they want to carry passengers for a profit. But apart from potentially breaching these passenger transportation laws, there are other fundamental questions thrown up by the Uber type of business model. Will the income be taxed properly? That's one question. Are the drivers employees of Uber or not? And if they are, should their employment then not be subject to social insurance? These are the questions that apply to the Uber business model as they apply to other similar business models in the so-called sharing economy. And it's these kinds of questions that have led to authorities in EU member states banning or wanting to ban Uber's operations. However, Uber argues that they have freedom of establishment and freedom to provide services under EU treaty law. And the EU Commission is currently considering whether such bans would be in line with EU competition rules. And indeed, a case has been taken now by the Spanish authorities before the European Court of Justice, asking the court to rule on this crucial question of what Uber exactly is. Is it a transport company? Is it a taxi company? Or is it a digital service? Is it an information society service? Is it a technology platform, as Uber argues? That distinction is crucial. And a ruling from the European Court is expected later this year in the autumn. Thank you.